got something I'd like you to ink. Can you come out to the house tomorrow? Well, fortunately, every time I left the house, I always took this little box of pens, brushes, ink, pencils, erasers, and stuff, just in case. And I always took it with me, my tools, when I went to Russ's house in Majestica Canyon, which was outside of Orange. And so I took this with me. Jack showed me the drawing, and it was the Marvel Mania portrait page he did of himself sitting at the board with all those characters swirling out of his hand. And I said, okay, is tomorrow soon enough? And he says, well, why don't you do it here? I'm going, oh my God. Every 20 minutes, Jack would walk in and look over my shoulder, and it's like, I am intimidated when people watch me work anyway. We broke for lunch, and Roz made sandwiches, and it was like, I was just like with my cousins or something. That's the way the Kirbys were. And so I guess this was my tryout. I don't remember him saying anything other than, this works, or this is okay. And at the same time, Mark was going to work at this little outfit called Marvel Mania, which this drawing was done for. And that was shortly after he met Jack. And I did several other pieces for Jack that were Marvel Mania items. And I also inked his Toys for Tots with the Marines and Spider-Man and a lot of non-comic book stuff. I got a phone call from him at some point in, was it 69 or was it 70? By 70, and he says, Mike, I'm flying back to New York City. I got something in mind, I can't tell you about it, but you're part of it. And I thought, well, what is he talking about? And a few days later, I got a phone call from Maggie Thompson saying, Mike, what's this I hear that Jack has quit Marvel and gone to DC? And I said, beats me. Then I don't know if Jack called from the airport, but as soon as he got back from New York, he called me and he says, Mike, I left Marvel, I'm going to DC. You were part of the plan, but they wouldn't go for it. And as Mark has helped me remember the details, it's really a nice compliment for Jack, and particularly Roz at his wake, to tell people that I was Jack's favorite inker. I, to this day, will believe that she was sincere, you know, and I segued and I lost the thought.
Okay, well, let me fill in a few things here. First of all, Mike was Jack's favorite inker, as evidenced by the fact that Jack hired him and always tried to get him. And, you know, there was periods there where Jack had any inker in the business, he wanted Mike. And it was personal as well as the fact that he liked the way the work came out. There was a personal affection there too. There was also in Jack an enormously great respect, and not just for Mike, but for anyone who was really good at meeting deadlines and getting the work out on time. And one of the things that I want to tell people was the most reliable guy that we could have gotten in the world. There was nobody else who could have gotten the work in consistently, got it done. And remember, he was not only having to ink as fast as Jack penciled, he was having to letter the pages as well. There are some very good artists who physically could not do that. Joe Sinnott and Frank Giacoya, to name two guys who I think were two of the best people who inked Jack Kirby, on separate occasions told me they didn't believe how much work Mike did. They said, didn't he have like a whole bunch of assistants to get all that done? No, it was just Mike. With every so often, someone would help you with a background.
Well, because I wanted to spend some time with my family.
Yeah, but Jack really appreciated the fact that Mike was so loyal and so efficient. And when Jack demanded Mike, when Jack demanded that they get rid of the guy before and give the work to Mike, the people at DC kind of went, well, this isn't going to work, this is going to screw up, and Jack will learn a valuable lesson, and he'll crawl back to us and let us pick the inker. Because there was kind of at that point in DC history a view that what the freelancers did, what the freelance writers and artists did, as talented as they may be, always had to be fixed in the office. It was raw material for the office to tamper with, to change, to improve, and they would turn it into a real comic book. And so they never really thought that it was possible to do the entire process outside their building. And what Jack handed into them was ready to go. Mike didn't even make a lot of spelling mistakes in his lettering, which all letterers do. They were really fewer proofing problems with his work, and it came in and it was on time and it's professional. Now, one of the things that was a problem here for Mike's acceptance was that DC didn't really believe that if you hadn't worked for DC, you were a professional, unless you worked for Marvel. The fact that you'd worked for Gold Key for several years, the fact that you were drawing for Warren at the time, for Creepy and Eerie and Vampirella, the fact that Mike worked on those Marvel superheroes cartoons that Grant Ray Lawrence did.
I laid out 1/3 of the first Spider-Man Saturday morning cartoon show.
And he worked...
And Grant Simmons, one of the directors, wanted me to be the voice of Peter Parker's Spider-Man. But Lawrence, of Grant Ray Lawrence, insisted on the non-union outfit in Canada.
You know, I mean, this was a guy who before when he came into comics working as Jack Kirby's inker, people thought, oh, Jack found some kid working in a drive-through or something like that. And Mike was a solid professional for what, 10 years before that?
No, I would say, well, from 6 or 7 years.
Okay, and not just a guy who'd worked for one company. I learned a lot of things from Mike. I learned how to letter from Mike. But I also learned how to be a professional and to meet deadlines a lot from him, because he really understood how to do this. And as I went through the business, one of the things I am personally grateful for is that I learned early on that you got to meet deadlines. And Mike was my role model for that. I worked for years for an editor named Chase Craig at Gold Key Comics, who edited all the Karl Barks stuff, all the Disney comics, all the Warner Brothers comics. And I casually asked him one time over a meal, who was the most reliable artist you ever had working for you? And he had well over like 300 artists who worked for him over the years. And without missing a beat, he looked at me and he said, Dan Spiegel. Oh, and Mike Royer also. And that's really good company to be in, because Dan was like that.
Well, when I met Russ Manning, through him I met guys like Sparky Moore and Mike Aarons, names that are probably unknown to you, but they were the backbone of the production art done at Western Publishing for the first Dell and Gold Key comic books. And Sparky Moore told me something that stuck with me my entire career, which probably doesn't relate to the production of comic books today, which I think is run by a lot of prima donnas, but that's my opinion. He said, Mike, you get your first job on your ability, and every job after that on your dependability. And on the basis of a letter from Chase Craig at Western Publishing, I got a mortgage from Bank of America as a freelancer to buy a house based on the fact that he said we set our clocks by Mike Royer. And to the chagrin of the people at DC and New York who assumed that I would fail, I didn't.
And Jack was very grateful, because Jack didn't look stupid for having wanted it. And that right there was another of the 12 reasons that Jack was.
Well, Mark kind of
loyal
put it in
to
a
Mike.
nutshell for him one time at WonderCon. He said probably the greatest single thing that you did for Jack is prove that he was right.
He was right a lot, but sometimes you couldn't prove it. Now I want to back up here and tell a story that Mike has forgotten completely. He will not recognize this story. When Jack moved to Los Angeles, which was in early 1969, Mike and I were friends. We talked on the phone. I don't think we met in person, but we talked a lot about comics. He was living in Whittier, and I was in West LA. And
We probably met at a WesterCon or something like that.
no, we didn't. We had not met in person.
He remembers everything. He remembers the phone exchange we looked up to call Al Williamson from...
In 1970, we went to New York together, and
we're Union Station down.
we were actually
lower level.
we were actually at the Statler Hilton Hotel.
It was
And he was trying to contact Al Williamson, and the directory assistance lady would only give him the names of the exchanges so he could look up individual phone books. Neither of us had a pencil or paper. So Mike turned to me and he said, "Can you remember these 4 cities' names?" And I said, name them off, and he named them off, and I remember them to this day. It was Milford, Matamoros, Kingman's Ferry, and Shahola. Okay. So he looked up, we went through the Milford phone book, and we went through the Matamoros. I think we finally found Williamson's number in the phone book. So Mike called me one day and he said, now you will not remember this, I bet. He said, I heard Jack Kirby has moved to Southern California. Do you know where he is? And I said, no, but why don't we try calling directory assistance? Because sometimes back then, when there was directory assistance, you could say to somebody, you know, I'm looking for this person, it's a new listing, and they'd look in a separate computer file or something, and they could find it. So Mike gets off the phone with me, and he calls every Jack Kirby they had listed. And he calls me back and he says, I just found an old lady whose husband Jack Kirby died. That wouldn't be our Jack Kirby, would it? And then shortly after that, we made contact with the real Jack Kirby, and he found Mike. So you don't remember that, do you?
No, I don't.
But okay.
But what's funny, when I moved to Southern California in April of 1965 from our home in Oregon, I looked in the telephone book the first week I was there and found Alex Toth. I wanted to meet Alex, whose work I liked, but I knew that he was a Noel Sickles freak, and I had this stack of Noel Sickles Scorchy Smith daily comic strips that I'd collected, and I called him, and I introduced myself, and I said, I've got these Scorchy Smith dailies by Noel Sickles, would you like to have them? And he said, yeah, come on out to the house. So I show up at Alex Toth's house. I stayed for 8 hours. To the chagrin.
And Alex Toth's like a short visit.
Yeah. And to the chagrin of his wife, I was invited to stay for dinner. Then after dinner, we watched a Johnny Quest, and he talked about working on that. And then a few months later, I don't know how many months, when I'm a member of the Cartoonists Union and working on Marvel superheroes at a union meeting, he walks by and he says, hey kiddo, what are you doing here? And I says, I'm in the biz. But it's funny. I saw Alex shortly after that first meeting with Jack Kirby at a collector's house in one of the beach communities, and Alex was there, and I said, oh, everybody, Jack Kirby said to say hello to everybody. And Alex called me aside and he says, what the hell are you doing telling everybody that Jack Kirby's here? And I said, well, Jack told me to. Alex thought it was to be a secret until Jack announced it, and in a way, that was Jack announcing it.
Well, Jack starting to go to science fiction conventions locally looking for talent, because Jack had this idea, he was kind of semi-promised by DC, that he could set up something in Southern California akin to the old Simon & Kirby studios, where he'd work with a lot of writers and artists. Am I getting a signal, Mike? Oh, okay. He could do some comics that he would supervise. When Jack went to DC in 1970, he didn't want to do conventional style comic books. He thought, for good reason, that form was dying out. Distribution was so bad of them. He proposed things that today we would call mini-series and graphic novels and such, and found that DC was willing to pay lip service to being interested in that, but really just wanted to put out the little 32-page crummy printing books. But he thought he was going to be able to leave the 32-page comics behind, and he would spend his time on graphic novels and supervise 32-page comics written and drawn by others. And Mike was to be one of the others, and I was to be one of the others, and Steve Sherman, who was lurking around here someplace, was to be one of the others, and he was looking for other talent. That never materialized because, as I said, DC didn't believe you could create a comic book outside their office, that it was possible to deliver something finished.
Well, I learned early that the attitude in New York was that the world ended at the Hudson River.
Yeah, well, they had that idea sometimes. Our friend Russ Manning at one point inquired of work at DC, wrote them a letter, and at this point Russ was drawing the Tarzan comic, which I think was outselling every comic DC published, and Russ had done Magnus Robot Fighter, which was a very wonderful comic and a fine seller. Mike worked on a lot of those issues, and DC kind of treated Russ like, oh, well, if you're in the neighborhood, bring us by your samples, maybe we'll try out inking something, or something like that. The experience didn't mean anything to them because it wasn't for them or for Marvel.
I think in a way that actually was something that bothered Russ, and maybe there's someone in the audience who could correct me who probably knew Russ as well or better than I did. But Gene, I always felt that Russ kind of carried that with him, that New York didn't think he was good enough.
Yeah, he did, and he also was very angry the couple times that DC reprinted his Tarzan strips during the Joe Kubert era because he thought they were sloppily edited and pasted together and that it was almost like a conscious attempt to demean his work because it wasn't, DC in-house Joe Kubert supervised work. He was very, very angry about that at times.
I find that the New York comic book companies never wanted to acknowledge the fact that Western Publishing, who had offices in New York, but the bulk of their stuff was done on the West Coast, outsold them every month.
Yeah. Well, they didn't, you know, if you went to the...
I guess until I started working for him.
Well, there was a little bit of that, because there were people who worked for both companies. You know, Jack Sparling was working for both companies, and Dave Wood and guys like that. But DC had this, we're number one, we have no competition attitude, and they had it even after Marvel was outselling them. It's just an in-house thing you have at companies at the time. I find it, one of the reasons I have never been exclusive or loyal to any one company is because they all turn into that at some point. They all turn into, you know, we do nothing, everything we do is wonderful. There's actually a DC executive who one time said to me, it's about 1974, you know, the best artist at Marvel is worse than the worst artist we have. Wow. And I said to him, you mean to tell me that John Buscema and Gene Colan are worse than I mentioned, you know, somebody at DC who was on, he says, yes. And then I said, so then I thought I had my little, excuse the expression, trump card. And I said, so now Gil Kane's working for both companies. Are you telling me that the Gil Kane art for DC is great art and the Gil Kane art for Marvel is bad art? He says, exactly. And then he says, Gil Kane knows he can't get away with handing that shit into us. And I went, ooh.
Well, it's a funny thing about those attitudes and about what they thought they were producing and what was great about it. And Stan Lee was the greatest snake oil salesman in the world. And I say that complimentary. But he did not create and write everything that he was paid for. But as a snake oil salesman, he took Marvel out of the doldrums and made them something, the world paid attention to Marvel. You know, when I met him, he came out to visit us at Grand Tree Lawrence Animation when we were doing the Marvel Superheroes show. And he was there for an afternoon, and that's where I met guys like Doug Wildey and Gene Hazelton, and
Herb Hazelton.
And Mike Aarons, and...
But Mike, it was Herb Hazelton.
What was that?
It was Herb Hazelton, even, not Gene Hazelton.
Oh, did I say Gene? I'm sorry, Herb Hazelton. You're right. But we're talking about artists. And Stan Lee says, you know, the Marvel artist is a particular kind of artist. If Alex Raymond walked into the office looking for work, I wouldn't hire him. And I thought, okay. And another little story, if you will anyone be offended if I use a four-letter word?
Oh, go ahead.
No.
I've never forgotten this. We would go into this one room and there was the card with Winsor Newton Series 7 number 2 brushes. And the way we always tested a brush is you pulled it off the card and you licked it. If you liked the point, that's the one you took. And I've never forgotten, Doug Wildey pulls out this brush and he goes, this stuff is shit. Now, that's 1967 or 68. I would kill for some of that 1966 crap. And they cost an amazing $2.50.
Anyway, so Mike worked, before he was working for Jack, he worked for Warren on Creepy and Eerie and Vampirella. He worked for Russ Manning on Magnus and on Tarzan. A lot of people don't know this, Mike was inking Mickey Mouse comic books.
Mickey Mouse, Goofy, Little Scamp, Chip and Dale.
Oh, wow.
And I worked for an editor who I kept asking for penciling assignments, and he wanted me to be inking other people's stuff. And so I never developed to be the kind of artist I wanted to be because I was always inking. But I had a wife and a family to support, and I had plenty of work. But one day I talked to Mike Aarons and Sparky Moore, who were doing primarily all the art in the Hanna-Barbera Superheroes and the Hanna-Barbera Adventures. For one of those titles, I went to Chase and I said, look, Chase, it would be fun for me to try this. Why don't you let me produce one of the issues? I'll get the guys to do it, you know, Sparky and Mike Aarons, and then I'll ink and letter it. And he said, okay. And with Sparky and Mike Aarons' permission, they said, go ahead. So I drew the whole book. Inked and lettered it, and he thinks Sparky and Mike Aarons did it. But he wouldn't give me pencil assignments for me.
Yeah, you get types sometime, you know, they know you're reliable to do something, and they want to take a risk of trying somebody new. But anyway, the point here is that Mike was a very seasoned professional before he ever inked Jack Kirby. And then when he started inking Jack's work, Jack was delighted with it. Although not the first job, the second job. The second job he retouched us some
Well,
things.
Roz used to tease me about the people who would write and say, who the hell is this Mike Royer? And I wrote about that in one of my afterwards, forewords, introductions, or whatever, in one of the reprint publications in the last few years. And I said that basically these people that were saying, who the hell is Mike Royer, had never seen undiluted Jack Kirby. And what they were seeing was pure Jack Kirby. And I was talking to Steve last night, and I shouldn't say this now, we'll probably talk about it tomorrow, but I look at some of this stuff now and I go, I ink 3 pages a day. I look at some of those demon double-page spreads and say, that was 2/3 of a day's work. And it can only be, it has to go back to that 40s and 50s and loving this artist, who I was not smart enough to find what his name was back then, that there was some kind of an affinity that when I was working with Jack, it just happened. I don't know. I've never ever inked, only one other artist did I ever ink more than 3 pages a day. And that was Ramona Fraden on a Plastic Man. And that's because there was a young guy in town that says, I'll fill in all the blacks for you. I did 5 pages a day on that Plastic Man. And Mark told me one time afterwards, he was in New York, and Ramona Fraden told him that she loved the work I did. That's the first time she'd ever seen anybody ink Ramona Fraden without changing it. And I still wanted to hear that from her. And the first year she was a guest at Comic-Con, I walked up to the table, introduced myself, and she said, you're the first person that ever inked me. If I were still drawing comics, I'd want you inking me. But she's a grand lady.
Yes, well, terrific artist. So the point here, by the way, we're doing 2 panels tomorrow. It's actually 1 panel, I think. It's 2 back-to-back panels.
We'll just be there for 2 hours.
Here where Steve, and we're going to talk about Jack a little more. I want to talk more about Mike here, because all this stuff, then we're going to go away in a minute from the Kirby era of his life. But the main thing, the main takeaway from this panel is, number 1, seasoned professional. Number 2, doubted by DC. Number 3, proved himself. There was a day when they thought, oh yeah, Mike, one of our best inkers, you know. And
well, they gave me work after they lost Jack back to Marvel, so that I must have proved something.
The job you proved it on was, and this is kind of an interesting story from my standpoint, is they gave Mike an issue of a comic called Freedom Fighters, which I believe had been penciled roughly by Rick Estrada.
Rick Estrada.
Okay, now, Rick Estrada was a lovely man who DC kept trying to turn into a superhero artist because they needed more superhero artists, and deep down he wanted to do these stylized romance comics, not like even DC did, because they had him inked, homogenized in the process. A very talented man, who one of the many artists who I think never got to be as good as he could, because the companies were plugging him in where they needed him, not where he would have been best. And he had penciled this whole issue. Mike took the issue and decided that the best way to letter and finish the art was to trace it on a light table. He took clean paper and laid it over, and he traced Rick's
and took
work.
his rough layouts and did finished work.
Right. Now, this is the way many, probably the majority of Funny Animal comics over the years were inked. Most times the inker would work on a light table, tracing the pencils onto other paper. This had been done thousands and thousands of times, and I was up at DC when Mike's job came in, and they went, Mike Royer has invented something new. They
even mentioned it in a letter column.
They had never heard of an artist doing this before. And when I said, well, Mike wasn't the first guy to do this, he was like the 900th. They didn't know, because they only knew the way they did comics. At DC, and this is true at Marvel too, these companies had this one rigid way of working. And if Joe Sinnott couldn't ink a job, oh, we'll give it to Jim Mooney. Well, Joe Sinnott and Jim Mooney were not the exact same person. They didn't have exactly the same talents. They had different strengths and weaknesses, but they never recognized that, because everybody was kind of interchangeable. And now Mike had done this job, taking Rick Estrada's rough penciling and turned it into very professional, finished art. And at that point, they forgot all the past skepticism of Mike's work, and just kind of went, yes, Mike, one of our talented guys we've trained and made him one of our stable here.
And my main motivating factor in doing this was that when the art was sent back to New York, to DC, Rick would get his pencils back and I would get all the finished pages.
Because Rick never touched the finished pages. Yeah. But Mike, you know, that you can win people over with steady work. You keep meeting deadlines, and they start realizing that you're good. And most of all, the word is useful. Mike was useful. And later, when they needed people to ink somebody like Ernie Chan and make it look more like Kirby, Mike was useful. And you know, you want people who are reliable.
I inked a couple of Ernie Chan Batman stories in Detective Comics and did my best to make it look like Ernie had inked it. And I still have the little inter-office memo from Julie Swartz saying, "You did good, kid."
So, anyway, Mike, let's talk about, now you and Jeff for a couple of years, and the killer pace got to you. You were, during that time, I know you were turning down some occasionally really good paying freelance assignments because you had this avalanche of work coming to you from Kirby. It didn't stop. Jack didn't take a couple of weeks off ever. It just kept coming and coming and coming. And then finally you decided, I believe you were staying on a mountaintop when you decided.
Well, my family, wife, 3 kids, 5 or 6 Girl Scout cadets, and their male leader. That's why my wife and I were there, is because they needed adult chaperones. And we did was it 7 days, honey, or was it 5 days?
7.
But I'm standing at the top of Mount Whitney, freezing, and I looked out at all the tiny little specks that were towns and things, and I said, I don't want to have the rat race anymore. I want to slow down. And I called Jack when I got back, and I said, Jack, is there any way I can only do part of the books? And at the time it kind of shocked me, but Jack said, well, it's all or nothing. Now I know,
because Jack didn't have anybody else.
and I know now, even if there was somebody in the wings, Jack didn't want different looks, comparisons, those kinds of things. So there was a 2 or 3 month period there. I don't even know how I got back to working with him, where he asked me, or I called him up and ate crow or whatever. But in that 3 months, I did a 44-page Jane album for that group that was doing the Tarzan stuff, and I did other things. And I wrote 33 pages of a 44-page Tarzan album that Russ Manning had started. And I still have my tissue layouts that I gave to Russ with indications and the panel sizes. And bless his heart, Russ drew it the way I boarded it in my script. It's never been published in English, darn it. But I got to do some other things and stretch my wings, and I really don't honestly remember whether Jack called me and asked me if I was interested in doing it, but suddenly I'm doing everything again. But when I would use help, D. Bruce Berry did some backgrounds for me on an issue, and I put the credits, and I said, with an assist from D. Bruce Berry. And when a young guy I'd met at a convention, Paul Jensen, lettered an issue for me. And Bill Stout did some backgrounds for me in A Demon, but in an interview he did on YouTube, he said he ghosted the whole issue and what it was like working with Jack Kirby. I've never asked him why he expanded, but a guy with his talent, what does he need to jump on the Kirby bandwagon? But I digress, I have bad manners. Because I'm very fond of Bill. I occasionally, because I'm petty, I remind him that he went to work for Russ at my recommendation.
Okay.
We had a great breakfast. I love Bill, okay? But he did not ghost Demon 15.
We worked on a bunch of foreign Tarzan comics for a while.
Yeah.
And Russ was the editor at first, and I was the editor, and we did a bunch of those things. And you went back to working with Jack again. And then you were freelancing, you did a couple other freelance jobs for Marvel. And then you did 1 page of a Barry Smith Conan.
Barry was really ticked because I was scheduled to ink this Conan. I think it's what, the Song of Red Stone.
It was the last, Song of Red Stone is the last issue of Barry's.
Anyway, it's really beautiful pencils. And I was just finishing this 1 page, and Jack calls and says, send it back, I'm ready for you. Barry was ticked because he never penciled that tight if he was going to ink it. So I did, and I defy you to find that page.
You can figure it out. It's not as invisible as you think. I spotted it and.
Well, he's good.
No, anyway, but, and he inked some Khazars, you had such a little.
Well,
face there.
I had a bit of an argument with John Verporten, the late John Verporten, who was production manager at Marvel. They sent me 2 Khazars, one at a time, that were penciled by Don Heck. Now, one of the things that I had an ability at was to ape other people's style, which is why I never really found my place in the firmament until I started drawing funny animals and realized that's me. But whoever I inked, I wanted it to look like they had inked it. So I did everything I could to keep my personality out of it. And so I get a book of Don Heck's pencils, and I like Don Heck's work. And so when I inked it, when it was finished, it pretty much looked like Don Heck had done it. Well, after the second book, Verporten called me and he says, you know, he says, I'm happy about those books. And I said, why? He says, well, I really wanted you to do a Joe Sinnott embellishment, you know, and I said, well, there's 2 things you didn't tell me, John. Number 1, that's what you wanted, and number 2, how much extra you were going to pay me. Oh, Mike Friedrich wrote a Khazar that was drawn by Paul Reinman. And Mike asked me to please redraw from scratch 3 of the pages. The final page was, I had fun because Sheena was tied to a stake and heaving breasts and that kind of crap, you know, that all real cartoonists like to do. We're just adolescents at heart. And so these 3 pages are totally Mike Royer. And guess what? When the inker got his 1/3 share of the inks, which 3 pages weren't there? Paul Reinman kept them.
Anyway, so Mike worked in and out of DC and did those things for Jack at times. When Jack went back to Marvel, for a while Mike was working for other people, and then Jack came and got you again. He wanted you back, and you inked a lot of the Eternals and Devil Dinosaur and those books. And then your life took an interesting turn in a Disney direction.
Well, I don't know if Russ or if Jack was slowing down, but for some reason, I had the opportunity when Russ called me and said, I'm going to do the Star Wars strip. Would you like to ink every daily and Sunday Star Wars and letter? Would you like to ink and letter everything on the Tarzan Sunday pages? And I said, well, this is the X number of dollars I want each week. And he said, okay. And I don't know if I talked to Jack about it, but Jack, it wasn't a case that Jack says, well, damn you for leaving me. It was like, you know, well wishes, and I think he realized that I didn't always want to be Jack Kirby's inker, because he always said, do your own thing, you know. And, but in those months that I was inking and lettering both the comic strips, Russ never got the full complement of stuff to me, so I wasn't making the money I thought I'd be making. Russ was late with Star Wars, and the Black Falcon office across the street from the entrance to the old Universal Studios, or the old entrance to Universal Studios, were complaining that he was late, and so bless his heart he would say, well, that's my assistant's fault. But I would drive out to Majeska Canyon to pick up work that had been scheduled on the phone. I would come out on Tuesday and pick up more work, and I'd get there, and his wife Dodie would say, oh, Russ and Roger are out fishing.
Oh.
So after several weeks of never making the week's income that I'd agreed to, I got a call from Sparky Moore saying they're looking for some freelancers at Disney in their comic strip division. Why don't you take in some samples? So I did a week's worth of Mickey Mouse daily strips that were horribly off model, and took them in and met with the head of the department, Don McLaughlin, and he gave me some inking assignments, I think on one of their Christmas strips and something else, and gave me an assignment to pencil a Mickey Mouse story. But I'd only penciled a few pages of the Mickey Mouse story, and he called me up and he says, would you like to come in and talk about your future? And I thought, oh, it's going to be a steady gig. It's a comic strip that he'll let me ink or something. And I walked in and he says, how'd you like to come on staff? And in less time than it takes to tell, I said, yes. And he asked me what I wanted a week, and I told him, and he says, well, we'll give you more than that. So.
This was the old Disney.
Well, since this thing is called Spotlight on me, And we're going to have an hour of talking about Jack tomorrow. Let me digress and tell you a little bit about Grant Ray Lawrence animation. Now I don't care who I insult because they're probably all deceased anyway. But Grant Ray Lawrence animation was very interesting. I had met Mike Ahrens through Russ Manning, and Mike Ahrens became my real mentor. I worked with Mike at his home. He produced a Batman comic strip based on the TV series at the time, which appeared in shopping newspapers in the South. And he's the one that taught me how to letter, and I inked a lot of his stuff for Peterson's cartoon magazines. But he hired me because he knew from Russ that I had this, with an ability to ink, was to ink drawings where they took the stats from the old comics, pasted them down, and drew extensions to finish stuff off, and I was hired to ink those. I wound up doing some original drawings of Tony Stark in the cockpit of his jet plane and things like that, because it wasn't comic book art to fill it out. And on the Submariner stories, not enough Submariners had been published at the time, and so we did a whole bunch of original stories. So I got to learn different inking techniques by inking Doug Wilding and Herb and Mel Kiefer and a lot of these people. And then Mike would occasionally let me pencil stuff for the cartoons, and then it was all done. And I called up Russ and asked him if he needed more assisting. He said, well, coincidentally, Gold Key has just added, or Western Publishing has asked me to produce more comics. And I told him the only way I could do it is if Mike assists me. He says, but in assisting, it's not enough money to support him. So I got a phone call from Western Publishing saying, would you like to come in and pick up some work? I mean, they didn't say, would you like to show us what you can do? Would you like to pick up some work? So the very first thing I did for Western Publishing is I penciled a frame tray Superboy puzzle who is flying away from about to being grabbed by a grizzly bear that painter in New York, George Wilson painted. And so then I started getting assignments with all their other stuff. He'd let me pencil an occasional inside back cover, which in half of the comics wouldn't be there because it'd be an ad printed for that part of the country, you know. But then I get a call from Grant Ray Lawrence Animation, and lo and behold, they're going to do a Saturday morning Amazing Spider-Man show and would like to come in and come back to work. So I go in and I talk to the production manager, and it should have been a clue right away as what was going to happen. The production manager had been hired from the construction trade. And I tell him, I says, you know, I can only give you 20 hours a week. Squeeze in 20 hours with all this other stuff I'm doing. And he says, well, and we can't give you screen credit. Now, I'm a naive 20-something. I'm a member of a cartoonist union, 839 from the earlier stuff. If I'd been smart, I would have gone to the union, told them that, and they would have jumped all over him, and my name would be on all 20 of those shows. I laid out 1/3 of them. That's when Grant Simmons said, I want you working directly with me, and I want you doing the voice of Spider-Man and Peter Parker. And then Lawrence said, no, it all goes to Trillium in Canada. But Grant Ray Lawrence, it was Grant Simmons, Ray Patterson, who directed earlier in their career Tom and Jerry cartoons at MGM. And Lawrence was a money man in New York, or
Robert Lawrence.
June Patterson, Ray's wife, was in head of the story department. And she had 5 writers. Every episode except one were 2 different stories. The one episode that's the full 20-some minutes is Elektra, Green Goblin, and Rhino escape from prison. I laid out that whole show. But she would have all 5 writers take a synopsis for one of those stories and write a script. 5 scripts, she would pick the one she wanted. Now, is it surprising that Grant Simmons calls me up and says, Mike, this is on a Friday afternoon, he says, come in tomorrow morning with your car in an empty trunk and take anything you want. Because Monday the sheriff's shutting us down, we're bankrupt. Wow. You know, it's like, thank you, June. Now, let me tell you how dumb I am. I go in on Saturday morning with an empty trunk, and I could have walked out with every piece of animation from Amazing Spider-Man. I thought, who wants this crap? The only original art that had ever been sent out from Marvel was a Two-Gun Kid page that Jack had penciled and Dick Ayers had inked, and a Captain America that George Tusk had penciled and inked, and I took those. And then I always liked the way they had painted the title cards on the old Marvel superheroes, and so I took a folder of those home. And left all the rest of it because who would want this crap? Now, I'm famous for throwing crap away. In the 7 years that I worked for the Disney stores, they bought everything I did. When I left the staff job at Disney, it was either take a 44 Magnum to work or quit. So I took the boss to work, and over a glass of wine, I took her hand and I said, Susan, you know how I've always said life's an adventure? She says, yeah, you say that all the time. I says, well, I'm going to live it. I'm quitting. She blacklisted me at the studio. I didn't do another job for consumer products for 7 years. But the Disney stores called me and said, please work for us. You'll never be out of work. You don't have to come in. Just fax it all. So for 7 wonderful years, the most financially rewarding and, more important, the most creative years of my entire career was working as that independent contractor for the Disney stores, and also having time to moonlight for Warner Brothers. And Hanna-Barbera, I helped produce a Johnny Quest licensing guide. Did 90% of the drawings. And every drawing they'd ever had of Doug Wildey's from way back in the 60s that wasn't finished, I completed it. And did new art in his style. Great time in my life. My wife and I would start the day with a cup of coffee, and we'd talk about ideas. She loved to go to antique malls. We used to tell people that she collects antiques. I'm 10 years older than her. I'm her first. We'd walk through a mall, and there'd be an old Jack and Jill book, you know, on a little easel. And they're standing on a little covered bridge looking at the water. She says, why don't you do Pooh and Piglet on the bridge? Well, what I did was Pooh and Piglet sitting on a log, fishing in a wooden barrel. But so she would give me springboards. And it was a great time in my life. And I discovered that, well, before that at Disney, that my bag was funny animals. I have spent the last, since 1979, I must have drawn 12 million napkins with Mickey and Goofy and Tigger and Eeyore, and but you get great service from waitresses.
Well, we're going to have to wind this up. How many people are surprised by all the other stuff Mike did besides being Jack Kirby's inker? That's the other takeaway from this panel. Tomorrow we will be sitting with Steve Sherman talking at length about Jack for 2 hours, and it's your rare opportunity to know every question you ever wanted to know about Jack from that period, because one of us will know it. Would you join me in thanking Mr. Mike Roy? Continue this by visiting his table over in the dealer's room. He's got lots of fun stuff and lots more stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.